need you to hold the mic for me, Joe.
We're just going to begin. My name is Mark Williams. I'm a professor of political science here at Middlebury and the acting director of the Jordanian Center for Global Affairs. I'd like to welcome you all to today's colloquium, the International and Global Studies colloquium. For those of you, perhaps students, who are not that familiar with the Jordanian Center, this is the college's flagship site for the dissemination of knowledge about international and global issues. It sponsors a lot of different kinds of programs, and these programs tend to reach across boundaries in culture, geography, politics, language. The basic aim is to help expand understanding of the world, a rapidly changing world. We try and do this by encouraging dialogue between scholars and practitioners who focus on these things and our own community and the broader community. That's the nature of what we do here. If I could just take a minute and peek ahead on our calendar to let you know what's coming up. We do have a number of different kinds of things coming up this fall. Some of the events will focus on South Asia, India, the Middle East. Others are going to focus on Russia, Eastern Europe. Others will also focus on the United States and themes like global health, INGOs, and NGOs. So it's a pretty cool place that we have for this fall. Today, we have a very interesting talk being co-sponsored by the Jordanian Center for Global Affairs as well as the Center for Social Entrepreneurship. It's part of our regular Friday afternoon colloquium series, and normally this series is devoted to being informed for Middlebury faculty whose work bears on some aspect of international or global affairs. But today, we're going to give it over to one of our amazing students. So we'll have a student giving a talk today. During the talk, please feel free to replenish your plate. Get seconds if you like. You will not disrupt the speaker. She's more or less been forewarned that this could happen, so it won't be a disruption. We're going to have a question and answer period after the talk, and then we're going to end promptly at 1:30. The speaker we have today is Rachel Sider. Rachel is a senior, graduating in 2014. She's majoring in international and global studies with a special focus on the Middle East. Rachel has been a recipient both of a Mellon Research Grant and a Davis Project for Peace grant, and it's the work that she did with this second grant that helped form the basis for today's talk about Jordan. Jordan is a country, we might call it a mosaic of ethnic diversity, and that diversity is an asset in many ways, but it also creates challenges in terms of cohabitation, tolerance for others. Jordan has for decades received waves of refugee flows from various countries in the area. And when Rachel was studying abroad in Amman last year, she wanted to understand what impact the arrival of Syrian refugees might be having on this rather already delicate demographic balance. Civil wars raging next door in Syria, Syrian refugees streaming into Jordan. What were some of the social and economic and political implications this was having on Jordanian society? Rachel used her Mellon Research Grant to tackle those questions, and then when she came back to the United States, she grew interested in some other issues. Notions of national identity, kinship, helped make Jordanian society somewhat weary of new arrivals. If these same kinds of factors made the Jordanian government fear social unrest and instability, then these same factors might also limit the government's humanitarian response to the crisis that was happening next door in Syria. So Rachel's Davis for Peace project was titled Empowering Voices, and this was a direct response to the reality that she saw taking place on the ground there in the Middle East. The basic aim of her project was to make a humanitarian contribution to the events that were unfolding in Jordan and in Syria. The title of her talk, Jordanian Hospitality and the Syrian Refugee Crisis, an Urban Reflection. Please join me in welcoming our speaker today.
Thank you all for being here. I first want to thank the Jordanian Center, not only about today, but also for giving me this Mellon grant that allowed me to really delve into some research questions that I've been having while I was abroad, and really enabled me to explore those questions on the ground, and really get a hands-on experience. And I'd also like to thank the Center for Social Entrepreneurship and the Davis Project for Peace Foundation for providing me with a summer experience that allowed me to really take what I learned in my research and apply it and hopefully make some kind of social impact on Jordanian society and also within the Syrian refugee community in Amman. So without further ado, I thought I would start by talking for about the first half of my talk about my research and some of the conclusions and themes that I recognized after my semester abroad in Amman, Jordan, and then move from those observations into exactly what I was doing this summer in the project that I was leading in Amman titled Empowering Voices. And so I'm going to read a little bit about some of the themes and observations I made, and then speak freely about the project I was leading. And at the end, we'll have questions. The country and the region are grappling with a large and growing crisis. There's a palpable fear that the place you were born in may look very different when you grow up. The Syrian conflict is increasingly affecting everyday life in Jordan and other neighboring countries. Jordan now has more than 500,000 Syrian refugees, with more arriving every day. And right now in the region, there's over 2 million Syrian refugees in neighboring countries, mostly in Lebanon, Iraq, Jordan, and some in Egypt as well. Some Jordanian towns now have twice the population they had last year. The resulting pressure on healthcare, education, and electricity is now felt by ordinary Jordanian families. For example, a mother has to wait days to take her 6-year-old daughter to the doctor, or a teenage boy has to move where he plays football because there's so much trash that's built up from some of these arriving groups of people. Meanwhile, Syrian families who have fled the conflict at home are now trying to create a sense of normalcy for themselves and their children as they seek to pick the pieces up of their lives. As these stories increasingly collide, tensions grow between host communities and refugees, and violence is increasing in the country. The conceptions of Jordanian hospitality is being tested over time. There is a rising fear that this small country is near a breaking point. In the last 2 years, more than 500,000 people have fled into Jordan from the conflict and are currently residing mostly in Amman, but also in Mafraq and Irbil, 2 northern cities, along with 2 major refugee camps, one titled Zaatari, which is in the north, and then Al-Azraq camp, which is in the northeast. The vast majority are living amongst Jordanian communities, staying with relatives or friends, renting accommodations, residing in empty shops and buildings, or even pitching tents on private or owned land. Host communities have often demonstrated enormous generosity for new arrivals, welcoming them into their homes, sharing key resources like water and electricity, and accepting their right to access health and education services within the community. But I'll note that over time, this kind of hospitality has really started to take a shift, and people are becoming a lot more frustrated and anxious that this conflict is just going to keep going on and more people are going to keep arriving. However, as the crisis has dragged on, the strain on local communities is becoming unbearable. The initial welcoming attitude of many is turning to anger. Many people now feel that their communities are becoming dangerously overcrowded. Basic services such as schools and health clinics are struggling to cope with the additional demand. Security is deteriorating, and many people see no end to sight in the current crisis. The presence of so many refugees threatens to destabilize an already fragile and volatile demographic situation in Jordan. And just a little anecdote, I have a few friends who are Syrian, and they went to a hospital to get some medicine, and there's a free healthcare project that's going on for all Syrians, but they've been turned away in hospital to hospital despite this project because doctors are frustrated and having to cope with so many Syrians as well as so many Jordanians that there just isn't enough space or enough resources or enough time to be able to treat them. And I wanted to share this photo because one of the obvious points of evidence that there are a lot of Syrians currently living in Jordan is that there's an ice cream shop that opened called Bekdash that's started in Damascus and it's really well known in Syria, and now there's a location in Jordan where Syrians are constantly going to, and it's a really bustling place, and it just proves that there's a market there, that there's so many Syrians that they're now starting to move Syrian businesses into Jordan, which kind of perpetuates this more permanent situation. So the major themes that I recognized were in terms of economic issues, overcrowding, and security. And I'm going to delve into these three themes a little bit more to understand exactly what the situation is like on the ground in most of the Jordanian cities that I visited. Host communities in Jordan are very worried about the economic impact of the refugee crisis now engulfing the country. Almost without exception, highlighted competition over jobs as either the biggest or one of the biggest challenges that most people face. It was widely reported that response funds aimed at helping refugees and providing limited humanitarian assistance were allowing Syrian workers to undercut local competition. As one person I spoke to noted, Syrians are employed informally. They do not have to pay taxes, they are receiving food vouchers and accommodation support. Of course they can afford to work for much lower wages. Local businesses are benefiting from the availability of cheap labor, while landlords and landowners are making significant profits on renting out land or living space at much higher prices. One Syrian refugee that I really got to know was living in a mine, just trying to, live in the city and keep up with some kind of menial jobs, just trying to find a way to live, and his landlord kept increasing the rent every week and every month, and would demand these high fees for the water that he was using in his apartment, even when he was using hardly any, and it was just him living there. So there's a lot of kind of frustration that Syrians are moving into these communities, and landlords are responding. The availability of cheap labor is also making it harder for average Jordanian workers to find employment, while the increased demand for rental accommodations pushes up prices. Although a section of middle class and wealthy Jordanians are somewhat removed from these implications, maybe even benefiting from the refugee influx, it is the poorest and most vulnerable Jordanians who are feeling the greatest strain. Shopkeepers, street vendors, construction workers, and those in the restaurant and hospitality industries. While access to jobs is causing a significant strain on relations between Syrian residents and Mafraq, Amman, and Irbid, and beyond, it is difficult to see alternative options for newly arrived refugees other than competing for paid work with locals. Many arrive with few savings and need to find a means of supporting themselves and their families, particularly given that the conflict continues to rage back home. They are often unable to fully access support from international relief organizations for between 1 and 3 months due to delays in the refugee registration process. They may be unaccustomed to undertaking casual labor and are often open to exploitation and abuse by unscrupulous employers from within their host country communities. Without more support being provided to new arrivals, these tensions could easily escalate. I'm going to show a few photos from outside of Mafraq, which is one of the major cities housing Syrians in the northern part of Jordan, and this is actually right outside Zatari, which is the largest refugee camp for Syrians, now housing about 150,000. And I just have a series of photos from Zatari that I'll flip through while I'm speaking. At the same time, overcrowding is becoming a significant problem in many host communities, specifically towns in the north along the Syrian border. Towns including Mafraq and Irbid have reported up to 100% increases in population in the last two years. When refugees first began to arrive, many were put in homes with members of the community, often friends or family. However, this proved to be unsustainable, and most are now renting accommodation, living in empty shops, or renting space on the periphery of towns. As a result, rents have soared, often by as much as 200% over a 6-month period. Significant strain is also being placed on basic services, such as waste disposal, water, and electricity. Municipality officials claim to have received no additional support from the Jordanian government to manage the increased load. Garbage collection fees, for example, in one municipality in Irbid, have increased by 100%, yet no additional budget has been allocated to manage this. Electricity theft is another common concern. In terms of security, Jordanians generally reported feeling less safe as a result of the influx of thousands of Syrians, and many reported that insecurity had increased dramatically in the last 6 to 12 months. Some reported increased levels of petty crime, especially thefts of mobile phones and handbag snatching, and house burglaries as well. There were also reports of street fighting, often between Syrians themselves, but also between Syrian and Jordanian youth. In addition to feeling less secure within their communities, political officials and community leaders in the north and in Amman also reported significant concerns that the Syrian refugee crisis was directly spreading into Jordan. Anxieties over Free Syrian Army recruitment and training in the north and the presence of terrorist cells was a common concern demonstrated by many that I spoke to within the Jordanian government. And at least half of the children interviewed said that they were scared of the war coming to Jordan, and many reported hearing gunfire from across the border. Tensions between Jordanians and Syrians are increasing, and as one shopkeeper in Amman explained, not because we are bothered by Syrians, but because there is a competition for everything, and it is starting to be a burden. When refugees began to arrive in Jordan in 2011, host communities warmly welcomed almost all who were arriving. The common perception was that it was the duty of communities to help them. This idea of Jordanian hospitality was something that was really admired within the region. However, as the burden on host communities have increased, so have tensions. These tensions are now high in areas in which my research was conducted and appear close to boiling point in places like Middlebury and Irbil, where even walking down the street you hear comments like, "Look at all of this trash, it wouldn't be here because of the Syrians," or hearing taxi drivers who, when a Syrian man would get in, he would say, "Sorry, I'm not going to drive you." So there's just these everyday comments that are really made that just demonstrate that this tension is not going away, it's only getting worse. There's a widespread perception amongst average Jordanians and Syrians that Syrians are benefiting disproportionately from the national and international humanitarian response, while poor Jordanian families are bearing the brunt of the impact. Sentiments such as, "Now there are more Jordanians who are poorer than Syrians and no one is helping them," and "Jordanians are asked to pay for everything. Syrians are given everything for free," were widely expressed among the people that I talked to. Many of the views and perceptions expressed by host communities, however, are starkly out of line with the reality for most refugees. The majority of Syrians are living in very basic conditions with extremely limited access to health and sanitation facilities. Many have struggled to register with UNHCR and are living in tented communities for which they are paying significant rent. Some have reported being unable to find work or start businesses due to discrimination from host countries. Others who were able to find work reported exploitation by their employers. Taken together, these factors contribute to a heightened level of frustration and anger within the refugee community itself. These findings point to a growing sense of discontent within host communities that I visited. They feel that their living conditions are only deteriorating, and rightly or wrongly attributing much of this to the presence of large numbers of refugees. This is a dangerous situation in an already very tense context, and there is a real danger that a small spark could ignite significant levels of violence. For me, I felt that serious action was needed in order to address some of these issues before it was too late. This is a photo from this summer, actually, not when I was doing my research, but I was working with a group of Syrian youth within the Zaatari refugee camp in the north, and we gave them all disposable cameras, and we asked them to document their world from their eyes using these cameras, taking photos of things that were really special to them, or things that they missed from home, or what did their room look like, or where was their playground, or what was something that made them feel scared. And we compiled all of these photos and put together a collage just demonstrating that the world in the eyes of a Syrian child was starkly different from the eyes of any Jordanian child that we also gave cameras to. And I'll get back to the photo project later. And it's interesting to note that when I was doing my research back in the fall, the Zaatari refugee camp, for example, was housing about 40,000 people. And at the time, it was unbelievable. It was thought that how could it be so large, and how are they going to be able to provide resources for all of these people? It's becoming a city. And now there are over 150,000 people living there. And when I went back this summer, I didn't even recognize the place. The security was insane. Just constant patrol. There were barbed wire fences everywhere. And I got lost inside, and I tried to look for a lot of the families that I had gotten to know when I was doing my research, and unfortunately, I couldn't find them. I mean, this is what they call Jordan's fourth largest city. So, going to this summer, I came back from abroad, processing a lot of these questions that I outlined in what I just read, and feeling like there was some way to engage people on this issue, because a lot of the humanitarian organizations and NGOs working on the ground are really focused on providing immediate and direct assistance to the most vulnerable people. But there hasn't been a lot of necessarily involvement in bridging this gap between the host community of Jordan and the arriving groups of Syrians. And I wanted to do something where I could bring people together and recognize that this is an issue that's not going to go away and that these tensions are only going to get worse. So I came up with a project called Empowering Voices, and what we did is I gathered together a group of about 30 artists who were both Syrian and Iraqi, formerly refugees, some Palestinians and some Jordanians. And we wanted to put on a public art exhibition that focused on the experience of the refugee. And it wasn't necessarily the experience of just a Syrian refugee, but the idea that over time, Jordan has welcomed waves of refugees, starting with the Palestinians, then the Iraqis, even some Libyans during the Libyan revolution. Most people don't know about that, and Syrians are only the most recent example. And each time there's a new group arriving, these same frustrations in terms of overcrowding and finding a job and security, they all really come up. But no one has tried to find a way to prevent that from happening, or at least ease that anxiety a little bit. So what we did is we got together, this group of artists and me, and we just tried to engage everyday people about this issue, because from our perspective, a lot of people don't think about this on a regular basis, and they find themselves making comments that aren't necessarily fair to a Syrian who's been through something like this. And I wanted to work with artists in particular because I've gotten to know a lot of Syrian artists while I was studying abroad in Jordan. And I found that these are people who are young professionals. They have skills, they have training, and they have this passion, but there isn't any way to express it because they're working jobs as a hotel janitor or as a secretary at a lawyer's office, because those are the only jobs that they can get because of this situation, because it's not legal for them to actually work. And it's hard working in the art world as it is in Jordan. And I felt that they had this power to really project their voice across Jordanian society and engage everyday people. So we started with a workshop, bringing together these 30 artists. And this is Hussam, for example, who is from Damascus. And I'll just share a little bit of Hussam's story to tell you kind of why he's involved. But Hussam, when I first met him, he told me that he was pulled over that day because he was driving his car that has a Syrian license plate on it. And he was pulled over. He wasn't speeding. He wasn't violating any kind of traffic rules, but he was pulled over because he was Syrian. And he said this is really common, that Syrians are targeted by the police, by a lot of the security forces, because there is this huge security concern that with the arrival of so many people, they're going to start spreading violence or revolutionary ideas within Jordanian society. So a lot of people get arrested just because they're driving a Syrian car. So that had happened with Hussam actually the day that I had met him. But it just goes to show that there is a lot of anxiety and a lot of frustration, and no one's really doing anything about it. So this is our workshop, and we spent 5 days discussing and analyzing the power of public art and artistic expression in social change, and what is the value of using art in a very public way to engage everyday people. And I will say that working with 30 artists, you're never going to agree on anything, and it was the longest 5 days of my entire life. And what I was trying to do is that I had this vision in my head, and I had this really well thought out idea, but I didn't want to go into the workshop and tell them how it was going to be. So I was hoping to facilitate a discussion over the 5 days so that it would lead them to the same idea that I had, but that it was really coming from them and it was their project. And it was a lot easier said than done, but we pulled it off. And there were days when the artist said, we're not going to be able to do this, we're all disagreeing, there's no way we're going to be able to pull this off together. And we did an activity here, for example, where we were sketching out our visions for what the public art exhibition would look like. Was it going to be all across the city in really public places so that someone was walking to the grocery store and stumbled upon something that really made them grapple with this issue? Or was it going to be in one centralized location so that people could go on the walk and experience what it is to leave your home and become a refugee and experience art in that way? So we had a lot of questions going into this exercise, and I don't know if we answered any of them actually at the end, but somehow we finished the 5-day workshop with a plan. And then it was the creation phase of the project where all of the artists went off and they had this vision for what they wanted to contribute to the exhibition. And this is Firas, who's a Jordanian. And he made a really amazing sculpture. But what's interesting is that Firas was involved in this project because this is just a passion of his. He loves art, he loves sharing it with everyday people, and he wanted to get at a different audience. Because the whole goal of this exhibition was not to get at people who already go to art galleries or who already are making an effort to engage culturally in Jordan, but that to get at people who wouldn't go out of their way to do something like that. So we were really excited to have Firas with us. This is how we transported our canvases because they were so large. I thought this was a funny one to share, but when doing a project like this completely on your own, you realize that there's a lot of moving parts that you have to figure out all by yourself. And this is one of them. We had a small budget, so renting a van and getting them to transport all of the custom-made ginormous canvases was not something I really wanted to pay for. So we found alternative ways to do it. This is a group of, there's Firas in the back, you can see, on the far right, sitting down. This is a group of 3 of the artists hanging out at one of our studio spaces. And the artist standing up, his name is Mustafa. And I'm not supposed to play favorites, but Mustafa is definitely my favorite because he is just someone who, he's 23 years old, he has a lot of passion and a huge heart, and he's from Dada, which if any of you know anything about Dada, it's the heart of the revolution. It's where the revolution actually started in Syria. And he came to Jordan about 9 months ago and has been living on his own in Amman because he was called up to serve in the army, for Assad's army, the government army, and it was mandatory that he joined, but he really didn't want to. And so his father paid off a lot of people with a lot of money so that he could get out of the country and get the papers that he needed to get to Jordan because there was no way he wanted to serve in the army. So he came and he has a lot of talent. If you see those 2 paintings in the background, those are actually his, and you'll see them up close later. But he's someone who's been through a lot and really wanted to share his voice as someone who lost a brother in the war and had to come to Jordan for safety. And then Obeida is in the front. I'll share a little bit about Obeida, but he is someone that joined the project but said he wasn't going to participate. He wanted to go to the workshops and listen and look really quizzical the entire time, but never contribute and never make anything for us, even though he's extremely talented as an artist. He's a painter, and he's from Damascus. And then about a month and a half into the summer, we're sitting in the studio space, and he's watching a bunch of other people paint, and he just can't hold back anymore. And he says, "Rachel, do you have another canvas? I think I want to paint something." And he tried to be pretty subtle about it, but I could tell he was just really itching to paint. And so Obeida ended up joining us, but he is interesting because he was part of a group called Black and White and Red, which was an artist collective that worked doing marketing campaigns and graffiti and slogans against the Syrian regime. And so he was really in one of the underground movements that was critical to spreading the revolutionary message. And in the end, it really put him and his family in safety. So he had to leave Syria and come to Jordan. And he's really trying to get out, actually, and go to the UK. So at the end of about 6 weeks of creation, we pulled together an art exhibition. We had to wrestle through government permits to get the art in public places because the Jordanian government makes it extremely difficult to put anything up in public without being arrested or being interrogated by the intelligence. So we pulled it off in this pretty public place. It's called Sharia al-Thaqafa, and it's called Cultural Street. And it's a place that was set up by the current cultural minister. That it's kind of under the ground in a big median in a really public area. And there's just tons of traffic at night and during the afternoon. So we ended up choosing this location and putting together the exhibition. So this is a group of some of the artists putting that together. This is the work of Mustafa, my favorite. This is a painting by Noor, who is from Hama, and she and her husband were both involved, or her fiancé were both involved in the project with us. It's one by Obeida. And this painting was done by Aziz, who is a Jordanian who's done a lot of work with Save the Children, which is one of the biggest NGOs working on the ground. And he was inspired by the children's experience of living in the Zaatari refugee camp, and he wanted to project that to the public. Another one by Mustafa. And this was one of the interactive pieces that we did that was basically asking, what is your identity? And asking people to connect certain words that they feel associated with to understand what people feel when they think of their identity, whether that's refugee or mosque or a certain food. So we wanted to find ways to engage people and get a response from them about what we were doing. More of the exhibition. It's another one by Obeida. And so I'll just close by saying that the summer was a huge success in a lot of ways that I wasn't necessarily expecting. But it turned out that we were able to engage hundreds of people on this and get a lot of coverage in the media, but also just within other arts groups and arts collectives that were interested in working with us. And we were able to project a message that I think hasn't really been heard in Jordan before. And we're hoping that this will continue throughout the semester, throughout the next year. The artists are working within youth communities, within schools, within the Zaatari refugee camp to engage a younger generation about the issues of being a refugee in Jordan and the challenges that come with all of that. That's my host family that came to see the exhibition in the end. So, any questions?
During the Vietnam War, when Americans wanted to evade the draft, all they had to do was appear at the border. Why did that young Syrian man have so much hassle to get into Jordan, paying off people and getting papers?
Because his name was on a list, and if he was conscripted into the army and they wanted him to serve, he would be on a list at all of the border. So he was concerned that if he were to just cross through the border, that the only legal ways of crossing are mostly held by government forces still. So they would have his name and they would interrogate him and he would go immediately to prison or something worse necessarily. So he was concerned that if he was found out that he was leaving, that would have jeopardized his life and his family's security.
So you're saying all those 2 million Syrian refugees are pro-government people because they've been approved by the government to go?
No, not necessarily. So there's certain crossings within Jordan, for example, that are held by the rebels. that are held by the Free Syrian Army. And they work with UNHCR, which is the huge UN agency that manages and deals with refugees, in shuttling them over in safer places that are not legal border crossings. So when these 2,000 Syrians, for example, the 500,000 Syrians that are coming into Jordan, the majority of them are coming through this way, helped by the Free Syrian Army and aided by UNHCR. But in the process of doing so, they have to either be registered by UNHCR or they have to go directly into the Zaatari refugee camp because they're not technically legal.
You talked for a while about sort of the stress that these Syrian refugees are putting on Jordanian society as a whole. Do you see something potentially happening the same way that has happened with the Palestinian refugees, where these refugee camps were built with the purpose of holding just a few thousand refugees for a few years before they could be integrated into society, before they could find a real home, and then they ballooned up to thousands and thousands of refugees living in very poor, quality, with low quality of life, and being there for much longer term than was initially. Do you see that happening potentially with the Syrian refugees?
I think it's early to know because at this moment, since the conflict has been going on for about 2 years, there's still hope within majority of Syrians that say we want to go home as soon as this is over. And I think there's the mentality still within the international development sphere that we're not going to let this be permanent right now because we're hoping that this is going to end and we can help everyone get home and rebuild back in Syria. But I mean, if this goes on for an extended period of time, 5 more years or so, I think that absolutely it's going to be more permanent because there's nowhere else that these people can go and they don't have the resources to do anything else. So it could easily become similar to the Palestinian situation. Yeah.
So Rachel, my question was similar to that, sort of pushing that forward a little bit. If one could make the case that the UN has contributed to making a permanent Palestinian refugee class in Jordan, what's the Jordanian government's attitude and relationship with the UN toward that? Do they see that as having been a mistake in the UN's approach?
Towards Palestinians?
Creating a sort of a permanent refugee class rather than trying to absorb the Palestinian community more fully into Jordan. And again, what is the Jordanian government learning from that experience over the past 60 years plus with regard to going down the road with the Syrian community?
I'll start with the latter part of the question about what has the government learned. To be critical, I don't think that they have learned very much because when I went into my research experience, I assumed, okay, Jordan has absorbed hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, then the Iraqis, like they must have a plan. They must have a procedure that they go through, and they're just used to absorbing all these people, and they have the services set up, and the funds and the resources to be able to do so, whether they're coordinating with UN agencies or not. So it's hard to tell if they've really evolved and realized that there has to be a better plan in response. And I think what it is that no one anticipated that this number of Syrians would be fleeing so quickly. I mean, right now there's about 5,000 who cross the border every day. And it's really hard to keep up with those kind of numbers for this amount of time. At the beginning it wasn't so immediate. And it wasn't until about 6 months in that people started to realize, okay, Syrian refugees, that's a thing. It's going to keep happening. But now almost 2.5 years in, it's becoming incredibly overwhelming and no one was able to really look ahead because you can't particularly anticipate how long the conflict's going to go or how many people are going to be displaced. Can you remind me the beginning of your question?
Jordanians view the UN. Are they a positive force in Jordan or are they viewed as having created more of a problem?
I think the UN was doing the best that it could in the Palestinian situation because there were just so many people that came over overnight, basically. And where can you house them? I mean, you can try to integrate them into the cities, but the city is expanding, and there's neighborhoods that are kind of all over the place, and so it just made sense, I think, in terms of city planning, to just build an area where they could stay temporarily, with the assumption that they would go back, and then they couldn't go back. So I think the UN it's seen, in my opinion, it's seen as the only solution right now, because the Jordanian government doesn't have the resources to be able to fund any kind of humanitarian situation like this on its own. So the UN is the only source, I think. So I think they're appreciative and thankful, but they would prefer that nothing was happening like this at all, of course.
You mentioned when you were putting this art installation together, there was some sort of bureaucracy you had to work through with the local government. Was that purely bureaucratic issues, or was the government actually sort of resistant to the mission of the project that you were doing?
It was both. Public art is not something that really exists in Jordan. It's something that's very present, for example, in Beirut, in Lebanon, as I'm sure you've seen. But people are the government is very wary of doing anything really public that would engage a lot of people, because then it may become a protest, or it may become a demonstration, and that's not something that they particularly want right now when the region is so unstable that they don't want any kind of movement in the streets. And so a large gathering of people, for example, checking out a public art exhibit isn't something they're excited about. And then I think about the message of the project, I think anything related to Syria, you're walking on eggshells, basically. And so when working with the government, we had to spin it a certain way. We said, this is about demonstrating the beauty of this demographic mosaic in Jordan, and we want to project that to all of Jordanians so they can realize that this Jordanian identity is extremely unique, and that we need to recognize that this hospitality that we have is something that is really unique in the region. So that's how we did it. Jordan?
Did you find any problems going into doing the project because being a foreigner, being an American, and not actually being Jordanian yourself?
Absolutely. I faced a lot related to the grant I was working with. So people said, okay, you're an American and you have this grant that's from the Davis Project. What is the Davis Project? Where's the money coming from? If you're American, the money must be tied to Israel. And just the politics of the region really got in my way, being a foreigner and having money from a foreign source. In terms of working on the ground, I think in some ways being a foreigner helped me, because I was able to convince the government, I think, a little bit more easily than a Syrian would, or even a Jordanian, because I came with some kind of credentials. I kind of came in as an organization almost and said, this is our mission and this is what we want to do. But I think in other ways, it required me to build a lot more trust, and it took time to integrate into society. And one of the things that I was really worried about was that going in and coming up with this idea on my own and saying, this is the project I want to do, would have been perceived as, well, you don't know what the facts on the ground, you don't know the situation we're facing, maybe this isn't the solution we want to the issue. And so I tried to build trust with the people I was working with to demonstrate that I'd been here for 6 months studying this, and is this true, the observations that I made? Do you agree? How can we go about finding a solution so that I was coming in, but I wasn't necessarily imposing my view on others.
Could you tell us what forgive me for my lack of knowledge in all of this, but what the demographics are of the refugees, who they are, families, ages, what work they did, what education level they likely to have, and the second part of the question is, what are their expectations of this end of this conflict? They want to go back, what are they looking forward to happen?
The majority of Syrians, for example, in the giant refugee camp, Zafari, which I'll go back to. The majority of the families here are lower income, bottom social class, I would say. They're people who were shopkeepers and bakers and just worked kind of everyday jobs, the average Syrian. most of them have extremely large families. So they have, 5, 6, 7 children, maybe even more. There's a lot of single mothers whose husbands are fighting in the conflict. And it's interesting because 50% of the refugees are children. So that kind of shows you how many children per household there are. In terms of in Mafraq, in Irvid, in Amman, and some of these cities, it really depends. So in Mafraq and Irvid, those are similar families, but they have enough money or they have savings that they can kind of live and hunker down and hopefully wait out the storm. Or they're people who are they have enough money to go for a little while, to rent a place, to find a job, and to find family maybe who live in the area. In terms of people in Amman and abroad, those are people who are either single and really well educated and kind of more wealthy, more privileged, that are able to get out and escape. It's hard to say. With a lot of the artists I was working with, they're single, they're pretty well educated, but they have no savings. They can't really work because the arts world in Jordan is very small as it is. So they're working random jobs. And they want to get out, but they don't have the money to get out. So, does that answer your question? Oh, in terms of them leaving, wanting to leave.
Yeah, what they expect to be in this, what would like for their lives in the future, and what they expect from as the outcome of this struggle.
Something that has really stuck with me is one of my really good Syrian friends from Damascus, who's one of the artists we worked with. He said to me one time, I used to have dreams, but now I just have hope to return back to Syria. So I think a lot of the young people are just kind of stunned by what's going on and the fact that it's been going on for so long and they aren't able to think about next steps, which is something I've tried to talk with my artists about, but just the idea that all we can focus on now is getting back home. And there is this huge pride within Syria for being Syrian. And just everyone wants to be able to go back home and rebuild their country and return to a normal life. And then there's other people who always had dreams of going abroad and always had a life plan, and that's just been completely put on hold, and they're trying to find a way to get out. But it's really hard as a Syrian when you're illegal in Jordan, to get out and to find an opportunity.
Rachel, this is a wonderful presentation. It sounds like you had a fantastic time while you were abroad. And you talked, stimulated a number of questions for me. Many of them you've already answered because I was told several questions. So I have 4. Please feel free to address one of them if you like. You had talked about how you were received by the officials in Jordan. I'm wondering, as a student from a U.S. institution, how were you received by the artists themselves coming into the project? That's one question. You mentioned the media reaction in response to the exhibition. Perhaps you might be able to say a little more about that. I was wondering if there were any big surprises besides how long that 5 days seemed to take you were talking about. Things about your experience that, for good or bad, were really significant to you. And the last question had to do with your background and training for this. Did anything that you learned in college in the end prove useful in some way?
None of it. No, I'm kidding. I'll start with the third question about big surprises because a number come to mind. I would say that, this will combine with the fourth question as well, but I went into this experience pretty naive, thinking that I had a plan, and I had come up with this great idea, and written a proposal and gotten a grant, but then when I had done a lot of preparation going into it. I spent a few weeks talking to professors and Middlebury staff members and faculty, just trying to prepare myself, asking questions, trying to gather as much information before I went into the summer, just hoping to be armed with as much as I could and to think ahead in terms of what are the challenges I may face and how would I tackle them. But I think even with that, I got on the ground and I just realized that there were a lot more details that really come with this. And I think some of the big surprises, one, which I mentioned, was the politics around the grant that I was working with. The workshop site, we were supposed to have it at a really cool kind of outdoor cafe and library and cultural center. And it was something that I had worked months in advance to arrange. I'd been, getting photos and like weird Skype videos from this cafe to kind of see what it looked like, and felt really relieved that it was arranged ahead of time. And then I got to Jordan, and 5 days before the workshop was set to take place, I'm there arranging the food order, the catering. And the director mentioned, after we've already discussed all the catering and all of the details, he says, oh, by the way, I was on the Davis Project for Peace website, and they've done work in Israel, or they've done work with Israelis and Palestinians, and I'll just say, like, there's no such thing as peace with Israel. So I'm sorry, but I don't think we can accept, like, we can't have your workshop here. And it was something that affected me professionally, but also on a really personal level, and I was really upset by it. And just made me realize that from then on, I had to be really upfront with people and say, this is the grant I'm using, and this is where the money's coming from. And by the way, there have been projects, projects for peace in Israel, or projects for peace between Israelis and Palestinians, because I really wanted to avoid any more surprises like that one. One more big surprise was, one of my favorite people that I was working with this summer was an Iraqi artist who was the youngest of the whole group. Most of the people I was working with were 23 or older, 23 to 30, I would say. And Abdullah was 20, so he was even younger than me. But he was really excited, and he was kind of the most progressive of the group, like really into this public art idea. And he wanted to do something really interactive where he was the piece of art. And he was doing something in the street to really get people to grapple with this. For example, he wanted to dress up as, like, kind of in really grungy clothing and carry a huge suitcase down, like, one of the biggest streets in Amman from the 7th circle to the 1st circle, and just, like, encounter so many people. And so I was really excited by his involvement. And by the end of the summer, he'd become really busy with an art project that had come up. And it was the night before the exhibition was set to happen. And he is someone I really trusted, but I hadn't seen his giant piece, his giant painting yet, because he was also doing painting. And so I said, I'm arranging this truck to get it for you in the morning. It's going to be all set to go. Like, this was such a hassle to try to arrange the transportation. Turns out, I get a Facebook message, not even a phone call or a text message, but a Facebook message that he didn't do the painting. And I didn't find out until the night before. And it was the special ordered canvas, and it was this huge ordeal, and I was devastated. But there was really nothing I could do because it was the night before the project launched. So that was another big surprise. But in terms of how this institution prepared me, I will say that I've been pretty involved on campus in service organizations and leadership roles, which definitely helped me kind of gain a perspective on how to tackle this project. But I really needed some kind of training in, like, development project management or something like that, where I was really on the ground. Like, I had months of training as a development project manager or something like that. Or maybe if I had done anything related to art in the past, which I didn't. But I don't know, I just learned by trial by fire, I would say. And maybe that's not the best way to learn sometimes, but I don't know, I learned so much this summer, and I think I was prepared a number of ways, but it wasn't necessarily evident until I was in the moment.
I think if I were a Syrian refugee in one of those camps, I'd be interested in moving on to someplace like Montreal. Are the Western countries over there helping people that want to move on, or are they preventing that?
So if you live in the camp, the only way you can get out is if you're sponsored by a Jordanian. And what that entails is someone in a community, in Amman, someone you know outside of the camp, filling out paperwork and pledging that they will look after you and that they will be you'll be under their responsibility. And so that's really difficult because a lot of people in the camp they don't know people. Or they have huge families, they have, 7 kids, and no one's going to pledge to sponsor them because that just requires a lot of resources. So the chances of getting out are unfortunately not very high. But if, in terms of the Western countries helping people get out, they're not helping people get out of the camps right now because they're hoping that this problem is going to end pretty soon. And resettlement of refugees typically happens 10 to 15 years after the crisis. So there have been very few efforts to actually resettle anyone outside of the Middle East because they're waiting out the storm, basically. I think Obama announced maybe last month that they were going to let 2,000 Syrians come into the country. But someone at the Refugee Resettlement Program told me that the Vermont Refugee Resettlement Program said those 2,000 refugees from Syria are going to be the most important, educated, critical people to the U.S. They're not going to be these families that are living here. They're not going to be the artists that I was working with, But a lot of other countries in Europe are starting to offer asylum to people who are already in the country, which is nice. But it's caused a lot of confusion for Syrians living in Jordan who've gone to the Swedish embassy, for example, and said, okay, I'm ready to go to Sweden, you're accepting me, and there's just this misunderstanding of what that involves. So resettlement isn't really happening unless you're already in a host country.
Last question.
So thank you for a really great presentation. I really loved the format and giving us the background before you got into your project. I was struck by one of the comments that it wasn't really related to your Davis project, but when you talked about the photography experience that you had the students do, or the children do, and I'm really curious when you describe the contrast, if you could just share a couple of thoughts or descriptions of what you witnessed and how that turned out.
Sure. So that photography project was actually part of the exhibition. There was a group of photographers that we were working with who wanted to put together a collage based on these children's expressions, and then they did portraits of these children as well. But some of the differences that I noticed, I remember when we were walking through the camp, and I was talking to the little girl we were working with, who's I think 9, and said, okay, let's take a photo of something that makes you really happy. And she couldn't think of anything. And then I said, okay, what about a favorite toy or a book or your favorite shoes? And she doesn't have a favorite toy or a favorite book because she has one book with her and no toys. And another one, something that makes you really upset. She had taken a photo of the gravel and just how sandy and dusty it was, because in the summer it's incredibly hot and it's dusty and people have to cover their faces and their eyes because it's a desert. I mean, the Zaatari refugee camp is in the north of Jordan. It's just in a really terrible location geographically. It's just total desert, so it's really hot during the day and it's pretty cold at night. And then some of the kids we worked with in Amman, for example, there's a Syrian kid who was working at a little shop downtown, and we walked into the shop and he was just sitting at this desk surrounded by appliances, old appliances, and he was running the shop, and he was 10 years old, and he was one of the kids that we worked with, and he said he took some interesting photos. A lot of the photos he took were of his family because that was something that he still had and that he was still holding on to, that he'd been able to come to Jordan, but his family was still with him. And that his world hadn't totally changed because he was surrounded by his family members. And then in working with the Jordanian youth, I would say that theirs were a little bit more normal, I would say. There was, hanging out in the neighborhood, taking photos at a restaurant, or here's my house, and here's my mom making tea for our family and some guests. So it seemed a little bit, what you would envision a typical child.